In this lecture, we'll talk about macroeconomic perspectives on demand and supply. Perhaps you have learned demand and supply in microeconomics class. However, in microeconomics, demand and supply has completely different meaning than in macroeconomics. And I will try to clarify those differences in this particular lecture. First, let's start with a motivation. And let's read this article that came up in the street. So, in this article, what was the Great Recession, its history and consequences? It's published on July 30, 2018. And here's the story. The Great Recession was a period between December 2007 and June 2009 that saw the 2008 financial crisis, some of the worst unemployment rates, GDP, and economic disasters since World War II. The Great Recession was brought on by several factors, mostly related to the Fox pause of the housing and banking industries, the subsequent effects of which devastated US and European economies. According to reports, real gross domestic product fell from some 4.3% from a high in fourth quarter 2007 to its low in second quarter 2009, and to boot, the unemployment rate skyrocketed from 5% in 2007 to 10% in October of 2009. While there were many contributing factors to the Great Recession, much of it had to do with the too big to fail mentality focused on large banking and housing institutions, as well as the growing housing boom during the mid 2000s. Now, here's the important question. The question we should be asking about is why economies go through recessions and booms or business cycles, and how to manage business cycles. Now, to answer these questions, we need to develop some models, because what you realize when recession happens, a lot of macroeconomic factors that we have been talking about, like unemployment, GDP, inflation, banking, gets affected. Now, question is this: how they are related and why they are affected. Now, to explain all this, we need a model, and in rest of the lectures this week and the following week, we will be talking about developing models to explain this fluctuation. Now, here's a further motivation. Now, till now, you have done concepts like GDP, concepts like unemployment, then you did inflation, then you did savings and investment, you did GDP. Now, the question is this: how all these are interconnected or related? How GDP affects investment, how investment affects GDP, how GDP affects unemployment, how unemployment affects GDP, how unemployment affects inflation, how inflation affects unemployment, how GDP affects GDP growth, how GDP growth affects savings and investment. We need to explore all these connections, and for these connections we'll develop something called ADAS model, or aggregate demand, which is also termed as AD, aggregate supply, also terms as AS models. And before we go in there, let's talk about some of the key facts about the economy. So, key facts about economic fluctuations. First, economic fluctuations are irregular and unpredictable. Nobody in this world can predict when the economic fluctuations, that ups and downs, are going to start and when it's going to end. And this is one of the puzzles in the world of macroeconomics or in economics in general: when recession starts and when it ends. Because if you can predict, you can take steps to counter it. However, in reality, you cannot predict. Second, most macroeconomic variables fluctuate together, but they fluctuate by different amounts. For example, when GDP increases, typically unemployment decreases, or when unemployment decreases, typically inflation rate increases. So all these are interconnected as I mentioned earlier. And finally, as output falls, unemployment rises, which is not surprising when GDP decreases, which means that a lot of companies are out of business. As a lot of companies are out of business, it lays off people. As a result, unemployment rises. And since unemployment rises, people lose their income. As people lose their income, they don't spend. If they don't spend, companies don't produce and they lay off more people. So these are the some key economic facts about economic fluctuation. Now the question is how to explain economic fluctuations? What are the ways we can do it? And there are two views in macroeconomics. One is called Say's law and the macroeconomics of supply. And Say's law is due to an early 19th century French economist Jean Baptiste Say. And his law was supply creates its own demand, which is popularly known as Say's law. What does it mean? It means that every time you are producing something, that means somebody is getting paid. If somebody is getting paid, that person is going to demand goods and services. So supply creates its own demand. So all as a macroeconomics we need to focus on is that producing goods and services, because more we produce, that means more demand we are creating, because production generates income. However, if this is true, then why we have recessions, or we have situations where we have production capacity but there are people without jobs, we have resources sitting idle? To put it differently, perhaps Say's law applies in a long run phenomena. Yes, what John Baptist Say said was applicable in the longer run when more production means more income. However, more production does not mean more income in the short run. And this is the view which is propagated by something called classicals or neoclassicals. Now, who are classical? These are the economists in the mid 19th century who believed in the forces of market, and they believed that market can correct lot of ups and downs in the society. However, Say's law cannot explain economic fluctuations, because you cannot have an economic fluctuation under Say's law, because supply creates its own demand. However, by 1930s we had something called Great Depression, perhaps the worst depression in the history of humankind. And during that time, Keynes' law came up, and Keynes' law was based on demand. And who was Keynes? Keynes was an economist who lived in 1930s, and his name was John Maynard Keynes, perhaps the most influential macroeconomist of all time. Rather, the field of macroeconomics pretty much developed around Keynes since 1940s. According to Keynes, demand creates its own supply. What does it mean? It means that if people are demanding goods and services, then firms are motivated to produce. However, more production does not mean that there are enough demand for goods and services. Let's take the example of the Great Recession of 2007-2009. What happened during that time? We still had the homes. We still had all the production processes. It's not that all of them are gone. All that happened was that suddenly people realized they don't have the income to support their consumption. Why this happened? It can happen because of different reasons. And one reason was that people felt pessimistic about the economy. Moment people or consumers like you and me started not buying things, so we stopped consumption. As we reduce our consumption, many firms couldn't sell their products. As a result, they went out of business. Often it's said that Keynes's law or Keynes's theory of demand creates supply applicable in the short run. And this is true to an extent, because in the long run everything gets adjusted. However, we live in the short run because in the long run we are all dead, as Keynes said. And remember, when we talked about unemployment, we talked about short run unemployment, also called cyclical unemployment, unemployment that caused by ups and downs in the economy. And in the world of economics, this Keynesian theory is known as Keynesian economics. And we will be developing both Keynesian and the neoclassical economics in the lectures next week. This week we'll develop aggregate demand and aggregate supply models, and we'll try to understand the economic fluctuations using aggregate demand and aggregate supply.